Walkers there on the side. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to have you all on board again. Early warning, I want to do some date juggling at the end. Madam's going AWOL. So I'll tell you all about that later. Apart from which, Judy, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome back, those of you who've been to Devon or anywhere else over the bank holidays. So we're doing the end of the reign of Henry II. It's a very interesting reign, a lot going on. I decided to focus on Eleanor of Aquitaine, his famous wife. I'm sure you've all heard of Eleanor of Aquitaine because of The Lion in Winter, the Hollywood film. So what do we know about Eleanor? Well, interestingly, we don't know exactly when she was born. Around 1122. Don't know exactly when. Her father was the Duke of Aquitaine. Aquitaine was an enormous area in France. And unusually, I don't keep saying this unusually, but it was unusual for women to have a good education. And her father believed in education, and he'd treated her as if she was a boy. And so she'd had this wonderful education, which included literature, philosophy, languages, together with practical skills. So she was unusual from the word go. She became a very fine horsewoman. But the most important thing in her early life was that she became an heiress at the age of 15. She inherited vast areas of France. At the age of 15, she became the most eligible woman in Europe. And 15 in those days, of course, was a marriageable age. A very exciting thing happened, a very dramatic thing happened. If you wrote this in a novel or a play, you'd say, well, things like that that's a bit over the top. But it did in fact happen. She was placed under the guardianship of the French king. Sort of the feudal system, you had to have an overlord. And within hours, literally hours, he decided that with this vast inheritance, he wanted her as part of the royal family. And he'd arranged for her to marry his son and heir. Whereupon, having decided, he sent an escort of 500 men, which again is totally over the top, 500 armed men. They told her, you're going to marry the heir to the French throne, and we've come to collect you. Sort of a parcel that needed to be delivered to the French court. Imagine what a shock that must have been. It was sort of minding your own business, and all of a sudden 500 armed men turn up and say, come with us. You are coming with us, no argument, and you're going to get married. That immediately. Not just get engaged or betrothed, you are going to get married. So within weeks of getting married, also this is also very dramatic, father-in-law, King of France, died, and she became the Queen of France at a ridiculously early age. She hated it. She hated Paris. She found it really cold. She came from the south, the warm south, almost tropical. She found Paris awful, cold, nasty, drafty palaces. And she was very homesick for the south, the warm south it was called, because obviously it was very much warmer than Paris. They weren't a very well-matched couple. Legend has it that he was crazy about her, but she was definitely not crazy about him. He turned out to be a poor military leader. That didn't actually affect the marriage all that much, but she began to realise that she'd got more of a grasp of what was going on than he had. She began to feel a sort of contempt for her husband, which wasn't very healthy in terms of the marriage. He didn't command much respect from his men. And then an awful thing happened, again, another dramatic incident. at a place called Vitry. The king was blamed for this, where non-combatants who were sheltering in a church, so by the laws of chivalry, they should have been absolutely safe. First of all, they were non-combatants. They weren't a threat. They weren't carrying arms. And secondly, they were sheltering in a church, which gave sanctuary, as we talked about last week. If you sheltered in a church, you should have been safe in those days. But in fact, royal troops burned the church down and killed all the people inside the church, which was an absolutely dreadful atrocity on several levels. And the king was blamed. He did blame himself. He said they disobeyed orders, or he'd never given orders. There was a controversy about who was at fault. Was it the troops that just decided they were going to kill these people, or was it a terrible mistake in terms of orders being misunderstood?
Some water.
But Louis volunteered to go on crusade as a penance. So very much like Henry II, acknowledging his guilt in the death of Thomas Becket, Louis decided that he would go on crusade. And to his surprise, and the surprise of his courtiers and entourage, Queen Eleanor decided that she was going to go on crusade as well. She was going to accompany her husband. And she wouldn't listen to anybody saying, this is not a good idea, it's not a place for women, what do you think you're playing at? She insisted, she was very strong-willed, even though she was young, insisted on accompanying her husband on crusade. And it turned out that she was a very much better organizer and commander of men than her husband, which must have embarrassed him and made her feel rather triumphant and feel even more contempt for her husband, that the fighting men were paying more attention to what she said than what her husband was saying. The crusade itself was a failure, and the couple were becoming more and more estranged. They were very different in personality. But the main reason was that she had 2 daughters and no son. They'd been married for a long time by this time, and she'd only produced 2 girls. And he needed a son.
Judy, when you say that a crusade failed, what?
They didn't capture Jerusalem, or they failed.
Right,
They failed in terms of the Turks were fighting back by this stage and winning back land which had been gained in the first crusade.
Right, and
So,
Jerusalem was the first.
So we'll do the crusades because they are very interesting.
Sorry.
That's all right. So the marriage was experiencing problems, and it was the Queen, again, fascinatingly, it was the Queen who took the initiative. Women in those days did not take the initiative, but Eleanor was not an ordinary lady of her generation. She was very different, which is why she's famous. She started to look at the possibility of an annulment of the marriage. There was no such thing as divorce. I'm sure you remember that from studying the problems Henry VIII had in ending his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. No divorce, only annulment. There had to be a technical, legal reason why the marriage should never have taken place, and therefore the Pope could cancel the marriage as if it had never taken place. So Queen Eleanor was seeking an annulment of the marriage, and eventually the Pope agreed. Popes were usually fairly flexible in those days. It's very unfortunate that by the time Henry VIII was wanting his annulment, the Pope wasn't flexible at all. But that's another issue. The Pope on this occasion did agree to grant an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, which meant a blood relationship which hadn't been declared at the time, that the couple had married innocently. Therefore, there was no blame attached. They didn't have to do penance or anything. Owing to, usually they blamed their lawyers. The lawyers didn't look into the relationships sufficiently well, and therefore the couple went ahead and got married, but they shouldn't have done because they were in fact blood relations, so distant cousins. That would do it, if you could prove that you were related in any way. then you could have an annulment. The two princesses stayed with their father. Eleanor regained her rights as Duchess of Aquitaine and recovered her enormous inheritance in the south of France, and was therefore vulnerable regarding acquisitive, ambitious men pouncing on her and saying, marry me, you are an amazingly rich heiress. Because on marriage, the rules then were the inheritance went to the husband. And that lasted until Victorian times, until 1883, Married Women's Property Act. Before that, women surrendered whatever goods they had, and houses or estates or money, whatever, became the husband's on marriage. So why did she marry Henry, Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy? He was a lot younger than her. He was 30 and he was 18, rather a gap. They'd slept together. That was one reason. Years later, of course, he became King of England and she became Queen for the second time. There's still controversy about why that marriage took place. She had found her husband very boring, and she'd found, certainly, she compared him with, she said, like living with a monk. So obviously their sexual relationship wasn't up to much. And so it is thought that that was one of the attractions. She'd found a younger man who was sort of virile and very manly, and she'd found that very attractive. But it did take people by surprise, to put it mildly. The age difference and the fact that, again, it happened very, very quickly, very suddenly, and caught people on the hop, really. So Eleanor is now Queen of England. She's already been Queen of France. She's doing pretty well for herself. And in terms of the succession, the marriage was a howling success. Because although she was 30, she produced a lot of children, 4 sons. Sorry, 5 sons. One of them died in infancy, so 4 reached adulthood. He was serially unfaithful. And she didn't sort of accept that, as wives were supposed to in those days. And in fact, wives continued to be passive in that regard. You think about poor Queen Alexandra accepting her husband Edward VII's shenanigans. You know, the woman's role was to pretend that nothing was amiss, nothing was wrong, just keep smiling and accepting that husband had many mistresses. Well, Eleanor wasn't a typical woman of the time, and she minded very much and told her husband so. Didn't make any difference. He continued to have mistresses and produce illegitimate children. She was very glamorous and sophisticated, words which were not current at the time, but those are the words we would use to describe her. Her upbringing had been very different. Southern Europe, a different culture altogether from Northern Europe. Courtesy, very important. Etiquette, manners being taught at an early age. She loved music. She was a very cultured woman. She loved music. She loved poetry. She loved reading. She was very good at riding. She loved riding, hawking, hunting, all the sports that were so popular in Northern Europe. But she was a cultured woman. She was regarded as very beautiful, as Martin's pointed out on a previous page in the notes. There aren't any real portraits of Eleanor, because until the Renaissance, there weren't any real portraits of anybody, because nobody in Northern Europe nobody could draw or sculpt properly. The Greeks and the Romans could, and then mysteriously the skill seemed to disappear and it was revived in the Renaissance. Very interesting why people in medieval times couldn't draw properly. They just couldn't. They didn't understand proportion, they didn't understand perspective. We can all recognize a medieval manuscript, with an illustrated manuscript, Illuminated, it's called, because the drawing is so simple. It's like a child's drawing. They couldn't show people sitting down properly. They couldn't show people. They couldn't draw a table properly. They drew it like a child does. So we don't know. We haven't got a lovely portrait of her, but she was renowned for being beautiful and sort of exciting. She was an interesting, vibrant sort of person. And in 1167, she did a very unusual thing again for women at that time. She decided she was going to leave her husband. It's usually the other way around. She moved her household to her own lands in Poitiers, and she lived there until 1173. And this is when she really became a woman in her own right. She established the court of love, the culture of chivalry. Now, the code of chivalry was already established, and that was for men, fighting men, that you didn't kill prisoners of war. Once they surrendered their weapons, you were supposed to look after them, feed them and house them and look after them and repatriate them when the war or the campaign was over. You were not supposed to kill non-combatants, men of older men, monks, priests, women, children, non-combatants. You weren't supposed to harm them in any way. And there were many other rules and regulations that if somebody surrendered their weapons, you shouldn't kill them. Once they'd given up their weapons or put their hands in the air, then you took them prisoner or whatever, but you didn't kill them, that you didn't torture them, that you didn't leave them without food, or there were many, many different rules and regulations that collectively were called the Code of Chivalry. But this was women taking over the court of love, which is a very unusual idea, where married couples and couples who were betrothed, their relationship was sort of put on trial, and it was like a court of actual women. That sometimes it was a romantic, something they'd read in a book. They were putting a couple on trial. They were fictional, but sometimes they were real couples. They were sort of putting their relationship on trial and hearing evidence. The court of love. Lots of poems being written and competitions for the best poem. A rather modern idea. Tournaments became popular, grand tournaments with a woman being chosen as the star of the show, the queen of the day, queen for the day or queen of the tournament. So a bit like a beauty contest. Troubadours. We didn't have any troubadours in Northern Europe. They were a Southern European idea. And troubadours sang, they weren't just minstrels. Minstrels have been known right back to Viking times, where they sang about the exploits of great commanders and leaders and soldiers, but didn't mention women. These troubadours were singing romantic ballads, which was new. And courtly love was emphasized. This was the idea, and this continued for hundreds of years, of a man dying of love for an unapproachable or unattainable woman, like they were dying of love for Eleanor, the Duchess. So it was never consummated. It was just man pining for this woman and doing all kinds of things to try and impress her, including winning in tournaments, in jousting, showing off to try and impress the woman. But it was there's no follow through. He never attained her. She was unattainable. She was like a goddess. So very romantic, and putting women on a pedestal, which they certainly hadn't been before, and giving women, or highborn women certainly, some kind of agency, giving them some a role in life apart from just being a brood mare, just producing babies. That's what they'd been before. Just, marriages were arranged. The main idea was woman would produce lots of children. Man would probably be unfaithful and not really care very much about his wife. So what Eleanor was doing was really putting women at the forefront. And this was new. This was new even in Southern Europe. So these were great new ideas, and this idea of the courtly love, the man doing all sorts of things to try and impress this woman that he'd fallen madly in love with. So then there were lovely stories of daring doers, like St. George killing the dragon, doing all kinds of things to impress this woman that he'd fallen in love with. So that created lots of wonderful legends and stories and fictional encounters, that he would have to swim across several rivers, often rescuing the woman. The woman was in danger and the man was willing to take all sorts of risks to rescue her. And then sometimes he claimed his reward, she was marriageable, but more often she was unattainable. She was either married already or she wouldn't marry him. She was above him in class, or there was a problem of some kind. And this went on for centuries. It was still very much in vogue in Tudor times. So what happened in a tournament was that each contestant asked for a favour from a lady, which sounds rather awful. It sounds like suggestive, that the favour was part of her veil, or a piece of jewellery, or a glove, and he would then either put it in his helmet or fasten it onto his saddle or bridle, so that everybody knew that he was fighting on behalf, he was competing, on behalf of this lady. And he was trying to win in order to gain her esteem and affection. So that just added a bit of spice to the idea of a jousting contest, that he was doing it for his lady. And then at the end, she would give him the prize. If he won, she would award him the prize. So all very romantic and interesting, and giving women status that they'd never had before. The other thing that Eleanor is famous for is introducing new fashions at court. She had total confidence, again, rather unusual. Certainly wasn't willing to take a back seat. She knew she was attractive. And she was also famous for acquiring all kinds of new fabrics, which weren't available in Europe and were incredibly expensive. So silk, which came from China, you can imagine how expensive that was, as it's coming right across the known world, not by sea, but by land, the Silk Road, long journey. So wildly expensive by the time it reached Europe. Muslin, which comes from the word Muslim, which could only be these fine veils that could only be made in the Middle East. Damask, again, takes its name from Damascus, only available and made in the Middle East or the Far East. Brocade, the same. Cloth of gold, cloth of silver, what we call lurex today, sparkly fabrics, not available in Europe, had to be obtained from elsewhere, vastly expensive. Well, Ellen didn't care about the expense. She got these enormous territories. Money wasn't an object. Money didn't count. She wanted to wear these fantastic, sparkling, shiny velvet, of course, which is a form of cotton. They did make velvet in Italy, but even so, Italy was a long, long way. Well, it wasn't a long way. It wasn't further away in Europe in medieval times than it is now, further from England. But the journey was very long. And so velvet was expensive. Now, all these beautiful fabrics, which hadn't been generally in use in England, suddenly were. Well, not in England, in Poitiers, but she brought them when she returned to England. She brought this fashionable idea with her, that rich women could wear rich clothes and sort of show off, basically, like the men did. So she was a patron of the arts as well. She encouraged poetry and music, troubadours. There were competitions, troubadours writing poems about recent events or making something up. It's almost the beginning of novels. People writing a script or writing something to entertain the court. It's the very beginning of pantomime, opera, and plays in a theatre. She was enormously influential. So a patron of the arts, that was very, very unusual for women, very unusual indeed, which is why she's famous. Not just because she was fabulously rich and she was queen twice of 2 different countries, but because she had such an enormous influence in so many areas. In 1173, this is when it all starts to go a bit wrong, she backed her sons when they rebelled against their father. She actually provided them with military support. It was her way of getting her own back for the unfaithfulness. She wasn't a spiteful woman. She just decided that she'd had enough of the humiliation of her husband being so serially unfaithful, and so she backed her sons against their father. Again, unheard of. You know, women in those days did not, even queens, they didn't take part in politics. They just they were very, very much sidelined. You know, their husbands didn't talk about politics to them. Women weren't supposed to know about such things. Well, Ellen not only knew about such things, she was taking a lead role. She was providing her sons with military support because she was an independent woman. She had her own estates. Eleanor then did a very surprising thing. She sort of asked if she could take refuge with her discarded first husband, and he said yes, which was rather surprising. But she was captured. She was brought back to England. She was put under house arrest. So again, famous for being the locked up queen. For the next 16 years, she had servants. She was allowed to wear her beautiful clothes. You know, she wasn't sort of chained to the wall or anything. She had freedom. She could ride in the estates around whichever castle or palace she was imprisoned in, but she was effectively a prisoner. For part of that time, she was imprisoned in Old Sarum in Wiltshire, and Martin's found a picture of what Old Sarum looks like now. It's actually the original Salisbury. I'm sure a lot of you have either been or you know about it, but just for the benefit of people who don't know, it's a fascinating place, Old Sarum, to visit. It actually was originally an Iron Age fort. So it's a hill, an Iron Age fort. And the original city of Salisbury was built there, but it's very restricted because of it being a fort. It's just the top of a hill. And there's a castle there, a cathedral, and of course lots of houses, and a monastery, lots of houses. And it became impossible to live there because of water shortages, because of its situation. And so, again, you probably know that it was decided to leave Old Sarum, this mound, and relocate down below on the flatland below Old Sarum, the new town of Salisbury, and build another cathedral and another castle, and everybody would have to build more houses, and Old Sarum just became derelict, really. They took the stone, they actually removed the stone from the cathedral and the castle and moved them down and rebuilt. And so it's a strange place now. You can see the outline of the cathedral very clearly. You can see where the castle was. It's an archaeological paradise. it's all grassed over. It's just really slightly weird. And the other reason, of course, that it's famous is that it was the most outstanding and famous rotten borough in the 19th century, when there was talk of parliamentary reform to modernize the system, which had been in place since medieval times. Which areas would have MPs, which areas would be parliamentary constituencies. And because the system had never been modernized, there were places that had virtually no population anymore for economic reasons, still sending 2 MPs to Parliament, including Old Sarum. Nobody lived in Old Sarum. There was no population at all, but they voted, this non-existent population sent 2 MPs to Westminster. And that's why it's called a rotten borough, rotten in the sense of having rotted away. Another famous one was Dunwich in Suffolk, which had fallen into the sea in late medieval times. They still sent 2 MPs to Westminster. There were many other rotten boroughs, but the 2 most famous, Old Sarum and Dunwich, that were sort of scandalously ridiculous. So that's the other reason that you may have heard of Old Sarum, not because it was the place where, one of the places where Queen Eleanor was held prisoner, but because it was the most outstanding and outrageous example of a rotten borough. And you're pleased to know that in 1832, the Great Reform Act did away with the rotten boroughs because they were absolutely ridiculous. So Queen Eleanor is in prison. She's moved around to different places. She spent some time at Castleacre in Norfolk. But the end of Henry's reign was marred by this terrible falling out between himself and his sons, which is sad because he was actually trying to do the best thing for them. He was trying to divide his kingdom, his territory, and be fair to his sons. He had 3 by this time, and then Geoffrey had an accident, and that left 2. That left Richard and John, both of whom did become kings in this country. But he was trying to be fair, and it all went horribly wrong because the sons didn't accept this. They wanted more, and the firstborn wanted all of it, didn't want to share with his brothers. A really difficult situation. So the Queen, having taken sides against her husband, made it all even more dramatic and awful for Henry II. And so in 1173, this awful situation, this sort of dysfunctional family, turned against one another, and there was like a civil war. The king's sons had turned against their father. And the Queen had connived in this, not just connived, she actually helped her sons against her husband. There were various attempts to heal this rift, but it never worked. It never. The church tried to get them to be reconciled. The Pope tried to get them to be reconciled. Every so often there was a reconciliation, but it was never genuine. It was always because some outside power and sort of harassed the dysfunctional family into making some kind of reaching some kind of agreement. Open war broke out in Aquitaine in 1182, and the heir, the young king who had actually been crowned, he died, and Richard became the new heir, and the bickering started again. One of the problems was John. John had been teased and laughed at by his brothers because he was called, they nicknamed him John Lackland, because originally the father didn't make provision for John. It was just, his plan was to just give him lots of money, but no land. And the brothers had nicknamed him John Lackland and teased him. He was the baby of the family, baby brother. But then the king felt awful about it and decided that he would make amends. He would let John become Lord of Ireland. And John went off to Ireland, and it was a disaster. John had a very strange sense of humour. He'd probably be very popular today. He had an ironic, sarcastic sort of humour, which was misunderstood by lots of people. And it was very much misunderstood by the Irish, because he was mocking them. He was mocking the way they dressed. He mocked the way they talked. He mocked everything about Irish culture. And as you can imagine, that went down like a lead balloon. He actually did go to Ireland, which was a plus point. He visited Ireland. Other people that became Lords of Ireland didn't bother to visit at all. At least he went. But he caused massive indignation. He insulted the Irish chieftains. He laughed at their ways. He laughed at their clothes. It was a disaster. So he brought nothing but trouble to his aging father. Meanwhile, Geoffrey, the king's second son, died in a riding accident. And that's why there was only John and Richard left in contention. John was very much the king's favourite son, and Richard was Queen Eleanor's favourite son, and another sort of toxic mix in this dysfunctional family. We all know it's naughty to have favourites, or if you do have a favourite, it'd be wise to keep quiet about it. They didn't keep quiet about it. They made it very clear that they had a favourite. So that certainly didn't help anybody. And there's this anecdote that Gerald of Wales, who was a chronicler of the time, which later now is a journalist, an investigative journalist, and he reports that when the king gave the kiss of peace to his son Richard, he said softly but loud enough for people to hear, "May the Lord never permit me to die until I have taken due vengeance upon you." So he said it loudly enough for people to hear and report. What an awful thing to say to his son, especially as the king was giving a kiss of peace to his son. It was obviously not meant in a very sincere way. May the Lord never permit me to die until I have taken due vengeance upon you. That sounds very sinister, and meant that the king certainly hadn't forgiven his son, even though the son was pretending to be penitent and dutiful, etc. The king had seen through that and thought, well, this isn't genuine. And then we come to the last years of the king's life, which were unhappy. So 1189, Richard allied with Philip Augustus, King of France. He treated him more as if he was his father than his real father. He attacked and defeated King Henry's army in the contest over Anjou. Now, by this time, King Henry II was suffering a lot. He got a bleeding ulcer. He was coughing up blood when he ate. And he was in a great deal of pain. And this was made worse by a riding accident. His family had deserted him. And as he was quick to point out, he got many illegitimate children who were grown up by this time. One illegitimate son remained loyal to him. And he mentioned this often. You know, of all my sons, my true-born sons have turned against me. What have I done to deserve this? And only the ones who are born out of wedlock are loyal. How has this happened? I've been generous to my sons. How's it turned out that they hate me or appear to hate me? They've turned against me. He found it very hard to understand. He was very bitter about the fact that his family had become so toxic. He retreated to Chinon Castle, and the legend is that when he was told that his favourite child, John, had also turned against him, he died of a broken heart. Well, this is part of the new culture of romance, that you can't actually die of a broken. I mean, they used to think the heart broke, literally. That if somebody had a pain in their heart, the heart had split in half or disintegrated, actually broken, literally broken. Because they couldn't do x-rays in those days or scans or anything, so they couldn't actually look at somebody's heart and see what had happened to it. But they did believe that people died literally of the heart breaking open, and that's what he died of. Not a heart attack, but broken. There are two versions of his dying words. And remember, people, he was speaking in Norman, well, not Norman French, he was speaking a form of French. So what we hear is a translation. So, shame, shame on a conquered king. And then the fact that one son, Geoffrey, who had made Archbishop of York, I mean, he wasn't ashamed of his illegitimate offspring, not at all. He promoted them. He gave them excellent jobs, and they all knew they were, and they had a title. Fitzroy means son of the king. Fitzroy, Fitzroy. Geoffrey had been made Archbishop of York, which is an extremely important role. And he'd stayed loyal. He'd stayed with his father. So the other thing that the king allegedly said was, "My other sons are the real bastards," which is, well, if he did say it, very, very pointed indeed, that the other sons had been disloyal and Geoffrey had remained loyal to his father. What a sad thing to say on his deathbed, because he knew he was dying. Shame, shame on a conquered king. He was succeeded by Richard I, who became known as Coeur de Lion or Lionheart, the Crusader king. And then when he died childless, he was succeeded by John, who at last had land, at last had an inheritance, became King of England. And everybody knows about John, that he was a disastrous king, although when we do about King John, you'll find he wasn't that disastrous. He did many good things, but they were, just saying to Martin before we started, history is very cruel. History does not always pay tribute in the right way or acknowledge successes. If somebody gains a bad reputation, then that dominates everything. Somebody's fallen from grace, a bit like Tony Blair. It's only the thing they did wrong that people remember. And their successes or achievements are brushed up, hidden under the carpet sort of thing. They don't count. It's only what they did wrong that hits the headlines. So when Henry II died, he made provision for his many illegitimate offspring. So, for example, he gave them titles. William de Longspear became 3rd Earl of Salisbury. Matilda became Abbess of Barking, a very important convent, very big. Morgan became Bishop of Durham. Queen Eleanor, again, give her credit, she had accepted her children, her husband's love children, and actually had them educated, many of them with her own children. I mean, how generous is that? Accepting them and saying, well, it's not their fault they were born out of wedlock. Now, Queen Eleanor lived for many years. She lived into her 80s, which was very unusual in those days. Following her release from house arrest, she assisted both her sons. She became a power in her own right. So the kind of third part of her life, she'd been Queen of France, she was then Queen of England, or fourth part. Then she went into voluntary exile, went back home, went back to the south of France, then was in under house arrest, and then wonderfully in old age became a very influential and powerful woman, helping and advising her sons. Now, the last point, Martin and I both tried to find illustrations to support this, the last point on your notes. I put there are many portrayals of King Henry's family problems, but we failed to find examples. One is famously, and he'd said this himself, the king had said that he was like a lion being attacked by his own cubs. A picture of an elderly lion lying down, being attacked by not little nice cuddling cubs, not newborn cubs, but half-grown, fierce cubs, attacking him, biting him, and trying to kill him. And there's then a similar picture showing the king as an eagle being attacked by eaglets. But we can't find actual proof of it. We can't find pictures to and another one shows there is another one showing the king fastened by ropes being attacked by Eleanor with a dagger, being stabbed by his own wife because she turned traitor. She'd supported her sons against her husband. But certainly he had compared himself with a lion, and of course the Lion in Winter is the film with Kathleen Hepburn as Eleanor, and that's where we probably get our idea of the family, that it was massively dysfunctional. But we shouldn't just remember that about Henry II. He was is designated as a great king because of the things he did to stabilize this country after the anarchy, establishing our system of justice, bringing law and order back to this country. And although he didn't spend much time here, he had established such a good working system, and he didn't feel he needed to be here. He didn't need to be here all the time, keeping an eye on things. He could afford to leave this country in good order while he went and spent a great deal of his time in France, looking after his territories, his estates in France. So these medieval kings are really, we have to say, more French than English, and probably more concerned about their territories in France than they were about England. But that gradually changes. It certainly didn't change in the reign of Richard the First, although he's got this fantastic reputation. And a statue of him outside the House of Commons, outside Parliament, which is ridiculous. You know, the Victorians absolutely loved Richard Lionheart because they thought he was very religious, because he was the crusading king. They're very proud of him. But it's a bit weird that there is a statue of him outside Parliament, as though he did something wonderful for democracy, which he certainly didn't. He was king for 10 years. He only spent 10 months of that time in this country. And when he came back to this country, it was simply to get more money for his crusade, or his contribution to the Third Crusade. He raised the taxes. He cost an enormous amount of money when he was captured and imprisoned in Dürnstein Castle by the Duke of Austria. Massive, massive ransom, we will come to that, which his mother did a great deal to raise. And because he was a crusader, our ancestors had to pay huge amounts of money, A, for the crusade, to support the crusade, and B, to get him out of prison when he was taken captive, taken prisoner. His ransom money was absolutely enormous. So what did he do for this country? Apart from, well, he didn't do anything for this country, really. He didn't benefit this country in any way. So why is there a statue of him outside the House of Commons? It's really quite offensive. But nobody suggested taking that. They're all busy now, going around all the statues in the country now, investigating whether the person deserves to be on a pedestal. If you've got any connection with slavery, then no, they should not be on the pedestal. They should be dragged down and thrown in a river. But
Didn't he support Robin Hood?
yes, Martin's just said he needs support Robin Hood.
Yeah.
Yes. But that's sort of legendary. So it's just interesting. How do people get an amazing reputation? And how come that in some cases people are challenged about their reputation and they lose their reputation because some awful fact is revealed and then they fall off their perch or pulled off their pedestal. And other people sail through historically and remain popular. Richard the Lionheart really doesn't deserve the acclamation he always received and the position that he had, certainly for centuries, and certainly the Victorians used him as a role model in public schools. You know, you should be like Richard the Lionheart and go and fight for the empire and fight for Christianity. Role model. And yet, why? Yes, he was a crusade. He was a crusading knight, but so were lots of other people who didn't get a fantastic reputation. So Henry II dies abroad and is buried abroad. And so next time we won't spend all that much time on Richard because he was only king for 10 years and spent most of his time abroad being a crusader. But we will do something about the Crusades because they are very, very interesting in their own right. They dominated the Middle Ages, and there were many, many crusades. Well, first three are the most interesting, but crusades went on and on right through until the 16th century. Attempts to capture Jerusalem. We had captured it in the first crusade. I say we, Europeans, Christians, had captured Jerusalem and set up a kingdom of Jerusalem. But then the Turks fought back, and then it was kind of ongoing, unfinished business. We must get Jerusalem back and open it for pilgrims, make it a Christian city again. So Richard the Lionheart combined with the Crusades next time, and then Martin's going to sort of explain something.
Yes, only the dates. We got another bank holiday coming up, and then Madam's going to have a cataract operation. One or both eyes? One eye. So we've looked at the calendar, and the next time we shall gather is the 12th of June. Sounds a long way away, but if you think it's the 29th next week, Monday 29th, spring bank holiday, so we would have met on the 5th. So instead of that, we will meet the week after that, the 12th. I'll put a note out to that effect for those that haven't made it today. And thank you very much, Judy. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you for your support.
Thank you, Judy.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Judy. That was brilliant.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Martin.